Hi, everybody. This is the Hungry Math Professor here, and thanks for coming to my channel to watch this discussion. And today we're going to discuss the book entitled When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin Labatut. And this is a fantastic book. I can't recommend it highly enough. I really think you should go check it out. And hopefully you've already read it because usually when I do a discussion, I will give away some of the book. But um, Even if you haven't read it and you're interested in listening to this, I would definitely recommend that you read the book. And in particular, the storytelling is just fantastic. The writing is really good, and he has me so energized and just energizes my passion at every chapter. And I'm just so interested in what he has to say. So just purely from a writing point of view and a storytelling point of view, it just really, really well done. Um, what's interesting is he tells the story in several chapters. The stories are seemingly one-offs, the somehow seemingly unrelated. But of course, as you read through the book, you start to understand that they are perhaps not related in particular via like the characters are not necessarily going to bump into each other and the storyline may not necessarily bump into each other, but there's a theme in the sense that he's going to discuss modern physics and mathematics, in particular physics and mathematics during the 20th century, and how that has affected, in particular, wars, but just how it affects like being a modern person in the 21st century, for instance, right? So the stories he picks are because they are illustrate sort of how modern physics and mathematics uh, affects what it means to be a human being in the 21st century. So, um, very interesting. He tells the story of Fritz Haber and Schwarzschild and Grothendieck and Schrodinger and Heisenberg and Einstein and various different other characters show up. So these are names of physicists and mathematicians that you may have heard of. Um, but he weaves them together in a way that I think is definitely new and very interesting. And he tries to pick out from these stories some interesting paradoxes of just history. In particular, one thing I find interesting that I'll just bring up is when he talks about Fritz Haber, he points out that he was very influential in inventing chlorine gas, which was this horrific weapon used during World War One. But at the same time, his discoveries helped to um, improve fertilizer using nitrogen, which meant that we could feed a lot more people, and it meant that we avoided, famines, right? But then, because we were able to grow so much food and we avoided these famines, now we have overpopulation, right? And we still have famines. So there's this like paradox of how, in one sense, this person was able to invent this terrible weapon, at the same time was able to invent something, help progress fertilizer development that was able to feed so many people. But then at the same time, now we maybe have too many people, and it's just sort of this paradox of history of how these unintended consequences of our developments, right? And I think for many of these people that he is biographing in this book, these are just curious scientists and mathematicians in a lot of ways, right? And they're driven by their curiosity. But in so many of these cases, the effects of their curiosity are huge, and a lot of times the effects are very bad, and sometimes they're good. But I think Labatut's point is perhaps not to judge it as good or bad, but really to highlight the complexity of how you even judge these things as good or bad, or in the grand scheme of things. It's part of the paradoxical sort of modern condition that we're in. Um, Another story that I'll just highlight because it's so close to home for me is he tells the story of Schwarzschild discovering a solution to Einstein's equation, which was very surprising at the time and somehow still kind of surprising in a way. But he's discovered it while he was in the army in World War One, in the trenches, and somehow, he's doing some calculations as a way of maybe escaping what he's witnessing, and he winds up solving coming up with a solution to Einstein's equation and sending it to Einstein. And what's interesting about his solution is that it's was the first solution that pointed to the existence of black holes. And at first, this was like a very perplexing thing. Maybe this is just a spurious solution. It's not. It's a mathematical solution to Einstein's equation, but maybe it's not physically relevant. And now we know that black holes are legitimate physical solutions to Einstein's equations, and they are well accepted in the physics community. We have observed effects of them experimentally, and are as best we can. And so it's interesting, though, that I think part of the reason why Labatut brings it up is just the bizarreness of the story, right? I mean, Schwarzschild finds this solution while fighting in World War One. It's like, what a crazy story of history, right? And it's such a gripping story, and it's close to home for me because actually a lot of my research winds up bumping up against the Schwarzschild solution to black holes. So I'm doubly interested for that case. But it's just an interesting story, regardless of whether you find yourself close to the mathematics or not. But then he also tells the story of Grothendieck, this famous mathematician um, who famously left the math community. And I don't want to go through all the stories here per se, but I just want to highlight them. And then, of course, Schrodinger and Heisenberg, and their influence on quantum mechanics, and then de Broglie and Bohr and Einstein famously being against quantum mechanics. And anyway, I won't try to retell the stories, but he does a really good job of telling these stories in a very gripping way. And at this point, I just want to point out what another part that's very interesting about this book is, from what I've said so far, you would assume that it's a work of nonfiction, probably. But I should point out that it's not exactly. It's a little confusing, actually. I would say it's mostly a work of nonfiction with a twist, in that not everything that he tells you is true, like in the sense that not everything he tells you actually happened in history. I mean, most of these things did, and of course, these characters are people that occurred in history, but he takes liberties with the story, and you don't always know when he's taking liberties, which is kind of interesting as just like a writing idea. Some people might find it frustrating, but I found it very interesting that he did that. If you read this book and you're like, I would like to know what was real and what wasn't, um, there is a New Yorker article that I can link to on the YouTube, where someone has written about this very fact, and does a tries to point out what is real and what's not. And just to be clear, I mean, of course, any biography technically is not 100% accurate, but I don't think that's not what I'm trying to communicate right now. Uh, I mean that I think the Labatut intentionally wrote some things which he knew was not true, and that was part of the writing, which is different, I think, than like the way we say that any biography is technically not 100% accurate. That's different. These kind of just human error is different than I think what Labatut is doing here. And I find it just to be interesting that he did that. But anyway, if you want to understand which parts are real and which ones are not, then you can read this New Yorker article as a way of diving into that. Um, and in the epilogue, he really highlights Einstein and Schrodinger's dislike of quantum mechanics. And I think for him, quantum mechanics is a great example of what he's trying to say. If we think about the title for a second, when we cease to understand the world, what does he mean by that? Because in some sense, we understand the world better than we did before. When I say that, I don't mean necessarily progress. I'm not saying we've made moral progress, or I'm not really making a statement about progress in general, but I think as far as like how deeply and how accurately we understand the world scientifically, we've only made progress in that sense. So what is he talking about, right? And I think part of what he's talking about is you can't expect the title to completely capture a complex idea. So what does he mean? I think he's saying that we've lost the ability for our science to more directly touch how we intuitively interact with the world. You know, not everybody would have understood Newtonian mechanics, but somehow Newtonian mechanics, when you learn it and understand it, somehow more directly ties into our intuition, even if it's not just a reflection of our intuition about the world around us, right? Newtonian mechanics is three-dimensional, at least, right? And I experience a three-dimensional world and time I experience. And so even though, again, like, Newtonian mechanics adds a lot more to the world than just what I experience intuitively, it does fit nicely into my intuitive framework in a certain sense. And I think um, quantum mechanics is a really important analogy for Labatut, and it's not the only Labatut's not the only person to point this out. This is a very common issue with quantum mechanics, which is that it's so very far from our intuition about how the world works. And this is part of why. I mean, I don't think Einstein expected our intuitions to be a good guide, so I don't want to mess up how I say this, but Einstein was very deeply disturbed by um, the non-determinacy of quantum mechanics. That he famously said that God doesn't play dice, and he was frustrated with the probabilistic nature of quantum mechanics at a fundamental level. At least that's how quantum mechanics seems to explain things. And so let me not get too lost in the details here, but he's just saying that we've lost the ability to connect what science is telling us about the world with how we seem to be living in the world as human beings. And um, I think he also points to this idea that there seems to be this sort of um, uptick in the or acceleration in the progress that we're making. Again, progress is a loaded word. When I say progress here, I just mean like the sheer amount of things we can understand in physics, for instance, just to keep it somewhat quantitative, perhaps. Um, and there seems to be an acceleration in the progress that we're making, but when that acceleration happens, there's also this potential for just losing track of like what are the second order effects of this understanding we have of the physical world. Um, what happens, just because we're motivated by curiosity doesn't mean that we're not responsible potentially for some of the effects of this curiosity, like, and I do think this is an interesting point. I mean, at times I think I'm a little frustrated because I think at times it feels like Labatut is really cynical about 20th century physics and mathematics into 21st century physics and mathematics. Maybe he's right to be cynical. I am worried though that the cynicism comes from a place of not completely understanding the physics or the mathematics that he's trying to talk about. And so at times I'm a little bit concerned that he's more cynical than maybe we should be. But don't take some of my negativity here to be a judgment of whether you should read the book or not, because I really think that you should read this book. I think it's a very good book, and I think it's the kind of thing that's going to make you think. And so even if you disagree with it at the very end, I think I do slightly disagree with it. I think I am better off for reading it. And I think I'm better off for having to think about Labatut's position. And I also probably don't completely understand what his position is. But in the last part, so there's an epilogue, but then after that, there's something called the Night Gardener, which is the last chapter. And I take this chapter to be Labatut trying to more directly, more explicitly telling us how he thinks. Maybe that's not right, but I think that is what's going on here. And he does try to tie things together a little bit. But he's doing it in a not so direct way, right? In a very artistic and well written way. He's not going to just tie it all up in a bow too nicely for you. But I do think here he is tying things up in a bow, or at least trying to some degree. So there's a little bit of tension between how explicit he wants to be and how sort of just artistically pretty he wants to be. I see a little bit of tension here in this last part between those two things. Um, But at the very end, he is quite explicit, I would say. So the even the Night Gardener, which is the last chapter, is broken up into several parts. And the last part of this, each part is maybe 2 or 3 pages long. The last part, I feel like he is the most explicit. Of course, he's talking through a character, but I can't help but take this to be coming straight from Labatut's mouth. And I do take a little bit of issue here. I mean, I'm a mathematician. That's why I'm called the hungry math professor, by the way, if you don't know. Um, and he does seem to blame mathematics for all of this progress, but also like the acceleration and the loss of control and being able to understand. We have all these bombs now, and we have to worry constantly about somebody potentially, using a nuclear bomb to just destroy tons of people in an instant. And that's just one example of all the modern things that we have to worry about. And of course, at every point in history, there was terrible destruction that you had to worry about and just random, um, just awful things. But he's pointing to the fact that in, you know, 20th to 21st century, the just scale of the destruction is hard to compare to other points of history. And the character at the very end points to mathematics as the driver of all of this. And maybe he's right to some degree. It's difficult for me because I am a pure mathematician. I see a lot of what I do as driven solely by curiosity, but also a lot of mathematics I don't think will have a direct application. But that being said, a lot of it will. And it's not clear how much we should blame or not blame that. I mean, in some sense, he's right that mathematics is the driver because mathematics is the language that physicists use, and it's the language that engineers use, and it's the language that is used to do all of the things that fall under STEM. And so, even if those people are not mathematicians, and even if they don't see mathematics the same way that a mathematician does, in some sense, they're using the language that us as mathematicians are developing to either describe the world in physics or then to engineer things into the world that would have all kinds of negative effects. So I don't necessarily completely disagree with him, but or I take his point in some sense, but I guess I would point to it slightly differently, maybe that what's to blame, or maybe it's not the right word to use blame. It's just our curiosity. As human beings, I think we are curious, and I think we'll never stop being curious, and we want to understand the world. And because we want to understand it, we start to understand it, and then we have unintended consequences. And these unintended consequences are somehow a huge part of the human condition. And it's not good, and it's not always bad, but it's this thing that we can't stop. And I feel like as human beings, there's a part of us that always wants to try to stop it. Like, oh, let's just stop looking, like, stop trying to understand. Like, it makes me nervous. It makes me anxious that you're trying to keep understanding the world. Let's just freeze it all and let's try to do the best we can with where we're at. And I don't think this is a crazy idea, but I do think that somehow it's just not it's not possible. You say you want to freeze the world, but don't you want to do art? Don't you want to do music? Don't you want to be curious in your own way? And it's hard to mandate people to not be curious about some things, but then you want to be curious about others. And so somehow I think that our desire to understand the world, which is often, um, done in a very naive or innocent way, uh, always produces, unfortunately, these unintended consequences. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't think Labatut's trying to be telling us what the answer is, but I do find, and I'd be happy to hear those who've read this discussion. If you have a very different point of view, I'd love to hear what you have to say, because part of why I'm doing this is just to engage with people who I think have interesting things to say. So I'd love to hear what your point of view is. But I do find Labatut's point of view to be a bit too cynical for me at times. And again, I'm just worried that that cynicism is easy because, it's you're a writer and you don't necessarily understand the mathematics in a deep way, or you don't necessarily understand all this physics in a deep way. And so the only thing you can do is be cynical, right? And that's not to say that at the end of the day, we shouldn't be negative about these things, but perhaps there's something more nuanced to be said by someone who actually understands these things in a deeper way than just pure cynicism. And, just to point out, the end of the book ends with this lemon tree analogy, which I do find to be interesting. I do want to just point out where he says that what's interesting about a lemon tree, I don't know this is true biologically or not, but that they die at the end, um, at this overabundance where the lemons become just way too big and they fall off and the trees die. And the analogy here, I think, is to say that, we've always been curious people, but somehow we're lavishing in an overabundance of curiosity. And it's not the curiosity itself which is the problem, but that what that curiosity produces in the world via physics and mathematics and just, STEM fields in general, what it's producing is, um, having effects on our ability to understand who we are as human beings and how we're supposed to live stably in this world. I do think that's a nice analogy for him to end on. Again, I really like this book. I may have some negative things to say about its overall message, but I want it to be very clear. This is a fantastic book. You should definitely read it. And I'm really curious to hear what you have to say about it, especially if you disagree with me. I would love to engage. I really think that disagreement is something to be valued, because when we disagree with each other, if we're acting in good faith, then there's a few things that can happen. Either I strengthen my position after hearing what you have to say about it, or I amend my position because I realize that you have something better to say. And both of those things are great. That's a part of being an intellectual person and wanting to grow, right? So, anyway, I hope that you read this. I hope you enjoy it and let me know what you think in the comments or email me. Okay, thanks.